because of how much I loved Borderlands 2, I was very excited when it was announced that there would be Borderlands 3 coming. Um, and for the most part, Gearbox was able to live up to mine and many others' hype for this game and deliver a really solid looter shooter. One of the biggest ways Borderlands 3 improves from Borderlands 2 is the updated mobility mechanics, quality of life improvements that came with the first person shooters that came after Borderlands 2, following along games like Apex Legends, mantling, sliding, and a ping system were added to Borderlands 3. These mobility improvements specifically improved Borderlands 3 from Borderlands 2 in a lot of ways. Borderlands 2 was a great game, but suffered a lot from there wasn't a lot of ways to get out and away from DPS from a lot of enemies or a boss. A lot of times, players in Borderlands 2 would kind of cheese their way out of a boss by hiding behind a corner because it was just too hard to fight them head on without a lot of mobility. Borderlands 3 is a little different in that way, how you can get in and out of cover really fast with the slide and gain a vantage point up, so you're not just hiding behind buildings, but you can get away from an enemy by getting up high through the mantling mechanic. Another way these quality of life improvements proved to be important for Borderlands 3 was one of the biggest complaints about past Borderlands games is, especially after you die, backtracking through lots of the map with no enemies in sight and just simply running in a straight line proved to be very boring and really slow down the fun of how frenetic the gunfights in this game can be. But in this game, they were able to break that up, those sections of moving across the map with mantling and climbing. It's kind of jumping section challenge changes up that what was before just running in a straight line and gets you to those firefights in a more engaging way. Moving on to the vehicles. The vehicles in Borderlands have always been a fun part of the Borderlands series for me. Some people struggle with the driving mechanics, but they come very intuitive to me, and I really enjoy that all the vehicles have some kind of weapon or firing method on each of them. Just makes using those vehicles that much more fun. Additionally, Borderlands 3 has added a vehicle on top of the two that were there previously, the Cyclone, which moves much faster than the other vehicles, but then its guns don't normally quite have as much firepower. Additionally, I do believe all shooters from now on should look at Destiny's model of a summonable vehicle, just because not having a vehicle in a part that's set up for you to have a vehicle can be a very frustrating part in games. Wastes a bunch of your time, and also vehicles are just cool, so having them more often is always a good thing for gamers. Probably the part you're most looking for in a review of a Borderlands game is to talk about the gun variety. This is another thing that Borderlands did great in Borderlands 2, but was able to expand upon in Borderlands 3. Alternate firing modes were a big part of the variety and versatility of guns in Borderlands. By clicking on the D-pad, you were able to alternate between two different firing modes on certain guns. And this allowed for just a lot of variability in loadouts, as the Malawan guns that traditionally have elemental effects normally have two different elemental effects from the alternating firing mode. So instead of having to force a gun you didn't like into your loadout just because it had corrosive weapons because you were worried about when the robots were going to come, and they always do come. You can just have a weapon that has incendiary and corrosive that you like, rather than forcing guns into your loadout just to have all the different elemental effect advantages in your arsenal. Next up, the vehicles in this game. The vehicles from before in the technical and the light runner return, obviously with an updated modern feel and weapons, as well as Gearbox was able to add a Cyclone vehicle, which did not have the same kind of firepower as the previous vehicles, but was able to move much faster. All the vehicles in Borderlands have weapons attached to them and some kind of firing, which really enjoyed. Can be a very frustrating thing in other games when you're on a vehicle that doesn't have its own guns. Additionally, the catch-a-ride stations, which is where you get the vehicles from in Borderlands, seem to be better spaced out than they had been in the past. Although I still believe every game should look at Destiny's model of having a vehicle that you can summon, because walking around in a vehicle section is just one of the more frustrating things in gaming, and walking is just lame. Moving on to the loot specifically, this is a looter shooter, so obviously there was a time where I was going to have to talk about some of the best loot. But before I get into loot specifics, one thing about loot that I think really is one of the better improvements from Borderlands 2 is the cooperation mode. The way this works is if you're playing co-op with someone else, each player will get their own instance of loot. So different guns will drop for each player, and you don't have to worry about somebody else coming in and grabbing the gun you want, because you each get your own versions. Additionally, in cooperation mode, the battle scales to each player. So even if your friend is their character is way more advanced in the game, say they're like level 30, but you're only level 8, you can still play together and each get enemies that are scaled to your character's ability. If you are some kind of crazy person who does want to steal loot from other people, maybe you don't like your friends, I don't know. There is a competition mode that plays just like Borderlands 2 did, with no scaling of enemies and only one instance of loot that everybody has to fight over. Now moving on to the individual loot itself, name a few legendaries that I came across, legendary items. That is the highest rarity item. These aren't necessarily the best legendaries, but just a few fun ones that I came across, and I don't really want to spoil all the legendaries, because as many of you know, that's coming upon them is one of the most fun parts of the game. First, the Abundant Dangerous Trevinator. This is a legendary shotgun that I came across. It's a Mal 1 shotgun that has a 75% boost to splash damage and 28% boost to weapon charge speed. Especially because of that charge boost, this is a shotgun that shoots incredibly fast. You can almost hold down the trigger, which is very rare for a shotgun. And the weapon has both shock and incendiary firing modes, which makes it very effective against flesh enemies. Even if they have a shield, you quick hit them with the shock, switch to the incendiary, and you can really mow through a lot of the bandit type enemies in the game. Next is the Firestorm grenade mod. This is an incendiary grenade that calls down, I think, is about 3 to 4 fireballs upon the spot where the grenade landed. So it does a little bit of an initial damage, and then a few seconds later, these fireballs rain down from the sky. Basically, it just obliterates enemies and specifically kills them with fire, which is always fun. Only thing about this is because they rain down from above. Try not to throw this at an enemy with a ceiling above their head, as the fireballs won't hit them in that case. Finally, there is the Dozing Gratifying Raisin's Thorns. This is a legendary pistol. It's a Torg weapon that fires a shotgun-like pellet spread that carries on in a straight line and does corrosive damage. It has an added 175 area to its splash damage radius and 94% to its projectile speed. Basically, it covers a very large area and does lots and lots of corrosive damage in that straight line. Finally, the part that turns people away from Borderlands 3 the most is the story. It obviously was going to be very hard for Gearbox to follow up the villain of Handsome Jack, because he was just so good and so engaging, but the new villains, the Calypso twins, fall very, very short in my opinion. They come off as kind of whiny and just entitled. They're both pretty young, and they just don't I think scare you in the way that Handsome Jack did. However, surprisingly, this is not the worst part of the villains, but the protagonists have just about as many failings. The heroes of the story do not really win you over in the way that they did in Borderlands 2. The cameos of old characters does kind of bring you back in and brings back that fun-loving atmosphere of Borderlands. But the new character, specifically a new character named Ava, she kind of just comes off as annoying and also a little bit entitled. And overall, the heroes seem to take on a more serious attitude that seems different than the general Borderlands attitude and atmosphere. And it really just seems lost in this game. But in the end, you don't really buy a Borderlands game for the story. You buy it for guns that scream or a sniper rifle that switches into a rocket launcher. So my final verdict, taking all that into account, all things considered, this is a very fun looter shooter, possibly the most varied selection of guns to date in any game, and the kind of attitude that lets you have guns that spawn other guns, because why not? Because that is Borderlands. The story won't win any awards, but it does the job to an extent, and quality of life improvements update the series and make it definitely worth the purchase. That will do it for the video. As this is a new channel, I'd really appreciate it if you could like, comment, subscribe, or share this video. So, smell you later, Keemosabes.